Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related stuff to take you away from the everyday grind of 21st century life. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to answer today. They've sent me writing notes for myself because I can't keep all that information in my head, which is my normal way of dealing with stuff. I'm generally keeping it in my head as much as possible. This time around, I've gone and done some research, so well done me. Anyway, you, of course, can ask us a question. You can send us a postcard. You can send us an email, comment on another video. You can do however questions are asked. I welcome you to try any of those techniques. Now, today's question is from Andy Shaw. Question for Murray. I'm listening to S.J.A. Turney's Marius's Mules. Over the first three books, he makes frequent references to the medical support for the legions. How developed were the medics? Were their skills another advantage for the Romans? Okay. Now, I am going to admit that virtually everything that I'm saying now comes from a fabulous article by Duncan Campbell in an earlier issue of the magazine, way back in issue 6/4, so it's 11 years old, but still well worth the read, as indeed most old researchers, to be honest. There's something especially interesting about reading research that goes back, to the 1930s and things like that. Ronald Syme still being one of the go-to books on Augustus, although, things have moved on since then. And there's probably a couple of modern scholars who are cringing when I say that. But it's a first stop. Mommsen, too, writing in the late 19th century is still a go-to in many, many ways. Anyway, the medical corps of the Roman army is a fascinating story because there's not a lot of evidence, but it's been extrapolated into a lot of evidence, shall we say. And there is some evidence which suggests that that's warranted, and a lot of other evidence that says, hang on a minute, we can't do that yet. So to summate what I've got here, there are only 85 individuals named in inscriptions and other evidence who are associated with medical corps across the entire imperial Roman history. So that's, a lot of centuries, 5 or 6 centuries. Most ideas about an organized medical corps come from an analogous idea that the British army in the 19th century, the Prussian army in the 19th century had a medical corps, therefore the Romans had a medical corps. As most analogous arguments, they're not really quite right. There are things that fit, and then there are things that don't fit. And the idea of a Roman medical corps as opposed to medics, individuals in the Roman army, is a tricky one. Most of the evidence, of course, is of individuals naming themselves as a medicus, which does indeed seem to mean doctor, and is there's no nuance to that. They're a doctor if they're a medicus. But we've got Vegetius in the 4th century talking about the fact that the medicus's skill restored soldiers to health, which implies that they're there in the late 4th century. But he considered that exercise and drill were far more useful for keeping soldiers healthy than a doctor was. He also tells us that it was the camp prefect, the praefectus castrorum, who oversaw the sick soldiers and the medics, the doctors who looked after them. So that's late 4th century. Vegetius is complicated because he may have been using earlier sources, or he did use earlier sources, and simply compiled them into his book, the Epitoma Rei Militaris, concerning military matters. But it could also be true of the 4th century as well. We've also got the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, which talks about Aurelian and how he reformed the practice that doctors were charging sick soldiers and wounded soldiers for their services. That implies that there were medics and doctors treating soldiers, and also that there was a corrupt abuse of them charging soldiers to have their skills. We've also got several jurisprudence entries which tell us about doctors in the army. Modestinus, who was writing in the 3rd century, but we know him from Justinian's Digest, tells us that the medici militum, the army medics, enjoyed exemption from taxes because they served the state. The Justinian Codex also records a law from the time of Antoninus Pius guaranteeing that the legionary doctor, the medicus legionis, was exempt from civil duties while he served. That exemption is interesting and important, which we'll come to in a minute. Lastly, we've got the doctor, the most famous doctor in antiquity, Galen, who was Marcus Aurelius's court physician, and he criticized other doctors during the Marcomannic and Sarmatian wars of Marcus Aurelius, so that's the 160s to the 180s. He criticized them for not dissecting barbarian bodies, not taking the opportunity to have a look inside a barbarian and see what made them tick and see if they were different from Romans, which of course they wouldn't have been, but would that have been recorded in our sources? Probably not. Anyway, so those are the literary references. We do also have Celsus and several others writing big chapters on the extraction of sling bullets and archery heads, arrows. That's what they're called, arrows, arrowheads from bodies. But we don't know, for instance, that Celsus was a military doctor. But more of that in a second. So we've got lots of inscriptions, which most of these names of the 85 individuals comes from. We get, again, a series of different titles. A medicus ordinarius on Hadrian's Wall, who's the doctor to an auxiliary cohort, the auxiliary cohort of the first Tungrians. Sorry, the first cohort of Tungrians. Another who served 2 different cavalry units. Now, the meaning of medicus ordinarius is perplexing. It has been translated as medical orderly and even a doctor with the rank of centurion. That's problematic. Both of those are problematic. One is orderly is not quite the right sense in the modern terms. A medicus is a doctor. They're not lesser trained. We do, and we will see other comments about and other names for lesser people in the ranking of the medical staff. So if you're a medicus, you're a doctor. And so it probably means more likely that it was a doctor who served in the ranks. So an ordinarius, meaning he was also a legionary or also an auxiliary who happened to also be a medic. That's interesting. We also have the idea of civil surgeons who are attached to campaigns on a short-term basis. It's that service that Galen refuses. Galen refuses to accompany Marcus Aurelius to the Marcomannic wars. So we've got essentially civil doctors are elected into the legions for a campaign, and it would seem that they might have been designated with the term medicus legionis, a legionary doctor. However, that's complicated because, of course, we have other titles used in inscriptions, such as a medicus ordinarius legionis and a miles medicus legionis. Miles medicus is another common title meaning soldier physician, if we like. So we've got that. We've got the idea of the medicus legionis, and that seems to be the idea that they are attached. We've got several of them named for legions. We've also got several of them named for Praetorian cohorts. And we've got one for a Praetorian who names himself as a medicus clinicus, meaning literally a bedside doctor, which is fascinating. Clinic, of course, coming from that, but not meaning beds, although kind of these days. And we also have doctors in the fleet. Now, all the doctors in the fleet are named as medicus duplicarius, meaning double pay men. We don't know why they are named as double pay men. None of the other doctors are. Perhaps being a doctor on a vessel was regarded as especially dangerous. Most of the other doctors that we have named are included in the immunes. So that is men who are exempt from other service, fatigues and other duties. So a lot of the other doctors are not necessarily double pay men, but they are exempted from boring duty, shall we say. Now, some of these men named in these inscriptions are only in their early 20s, 22 and 23. Others are 47 and 50 years old. So they're all sorts of ages. And the different titles do imply some kind of ranking system, which is interesting and problematic all at the same time. We've got other titles, the Optio Valetudinari and the Capsari. Now, the Optio Valetudinari are the hospital orderlies, and the Capsari are the satchel men. Now, that's an issue because, of course, a satchel man seems to have been a junior assistant, but there are other livelihoods that include capsari. Roman schoolboys had capsari to carry their satchel to school. And what exactly the satchel has to do with medical science, we're not sure. It has been translated as wound dresser, the satchel being the satchel that carried the bandages, but that's unclear. And I mean, they're not just an assistant in the sense that they're a person carrying a satchel, because we have an inscription naming trainee capsari. So they are being trained in some kind of medical process, maybe wound dressing, who can say. So it was some kind of skill. We also have a single inscription naming a seplasanius, some kind of pharmacist or ointment apothecary. So there's all sorts of different ranks in that. Now, we don't know how many medical med there were per unit. We do have them attached to vexallations of troops. Some are named for the cohort they serve, but we do have one that names himself as a medicus vexallationis, a detachment physician. Legionary fortresses do have hospitals, the valetudinarium, to house all the invalids. And as we heard from Vegetius, it's the prefect of the camp's responsibility for those people, not only the people running the hospital, but the people in the hospital. The first identified legionary fortress hospital was at Neuss, Novacium in Germany, but most excavated legionary fortresses have had one of their buildings identified as a hospital. At Aquincum, Budapest, modern Budapest, we know from several inscriptions a whole series of these different titles, and it's the best evidence we've got of a system. The problem is, of course, most other inscriptions don't have the system, they just have the single inscription. But at Aquincum, we have we have several medici legionis, a miles medicus legionis, 2 optiones valetudinari, and a capsarius. So you've got a legionary doctor, a soldier doctor-physician, 2 hospital orderlies, and 1 satchel man, which implies a system and a hierarchy and some kind of institutionalized medical care. The question is that enough to say every legionary fortress had that system? Probably not. And it's also a spanner in those works is auxiliary forts. Now, we know from the inscriptions that there are auxiliary medici, there are auxiliary doctors, but no auxiliary fort has had a hospital identified. So we have inscriptions naming hospitals associated with auxiliary forts, but no building has been associated or identified as that. Even Vindelander, which has a tablet saying 12 builders are being sent to help build the hospital, we still don't have a hospital identified at the Vindelander fort. So that is a problem in itself. So based on that Budapest inscription or inscriptions, yes, there's a system. Of course, there's a famous image from Trajan's column of someone tending to the wounds of a wounded soldier in the Roman ranks. And so it does seem that there were doctors looking after wounds of Romans. There were hospitals and legionary fortresses. And there does seem to have been a system. What that system was is probably something we can't actually risk saying, because we don't have enough evidence to say this was the system, if indeed there was just one system. And so you can say all of that with so many caveats, but there does seem to have been some kind of system of different ranks and different hierarchies to look after injured Roman soldiers. Whether that was an edge, of course it would be an edge, you can get them back to the battle, or how much of an edge it was is up for debate, but certainly it's something that the Romans did possess. I hope that answers your question, and you can join me again for another Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.